America in the 1930s was down in the dumps. For obvious reasons, as the Great Depression was crushing basically everything and everyone in its path. It was a time of great despair, and in times of great despair, sometimes we have to turn to our heroes in sport to lift us up. In that same breath, we gotta acknowledge that the heroes we turn to often reflect the times in which we live. Take James J. Braddock. Braddock's story sounds like it comes off the pages of a Hallmark movie. He was a dirt-poor boxer who was living off disability and relief payments, a whopping $24 a month, and handouts wherever he could get them. He worked as a longshoreman, basically a port worker in a shipyard, and he had a wife and 2 kids. While he's doing all this, he was also basically moonlighting as a boxer and a really respected heavyweight boxer. So much so that in the early 1930s, he was picked to kind of be a stepping stone for some of the other younger heavyweights to work their way up to become the world heavyweight champion. Instead, Braddock won those fights, and in 1935, he stunned the world by defeating the then world heavyweight champion Max Baer, despite being a 10-1 underdog in the fight. Braddock, an Irish-American born in New York City and living in Jersey, quote, represented perfectly the strain of athletic heroism the American public and the pre-television media were prepared to embrace, end quote. He was humble, hard-working, stoic, and had a dry and understated sense of humor. And he would earn himself a new nickname, Cinderella Man, which was also the title of the 2005 movie where he was played by Russell Crowe. Seriously, go watch Cinderella Man when you have the time. Great movie. Meanwhile, Braddock's opponent, Max Baer, sounds like a cartoon villain. He apparently boasted that he was the world's greatest fighter and the world's greatest lover. He dressed and spent lavishly, talked all of the shit in the world, and absolutely did not take Braddock seriously in the lead up to their fight. He paid for it with his loss, but in his lavish lifestyle, Baer had planted a seed for the future that Braddock simply had not. It was a seed that one George Wagner would soon water and nourish, and in the process become gorgeous. I'm Mike GW, and you're listening to Surreal Sports Stories. When we last left George Wagner, he was a young and scrappy man who had a hunger to make it in the pro wrestling business, but no real way to make it big. After all, he was a dime a dozen. Ethnic wrestlers with ethnic last names were a useful draw for immigrant-heavy communities across the United States, but if you'd seen one, you'd have seen them all. And in order for someone to stand out, they'd really need to start pushing the envelope. And to push the envelope, George would need a willing accomplice. He found her at a movie theater. Elizabeth Betty Hansen had been working at the theater for a year when, in 1938, George Wagner strolled in through the front door. He'd been invited to see a show for free because the theater projectionist was a friend that he'd made on the wrestling circuit. It didn't take long before he realized that the real thing to see there was, of course, Miss Hansen. Though the two didn't start dating immediately, it wasn't long before the two were married. You know the saying how behind every successful man is a woman? Well, Betty Hansen was going to prove exactly how much that was true in the case of dear old Georgie. So for starters, she and George would have their wedding in the middle of a wrestling ring to celebrate their nuptials. Note that I say a wedding because, well, when people paid to see it, they decided to get some big ideas for it. An entire wrestling show was booked around the wedding of George Wagner and Betty Hansen as the main event, and the move proved so popular that the two took their show on the road, reenacting the wedding in multiple locations across the country. Don't worry, they also did have like a legitimate wedding as well too, but it's show business, darling, just roll with it. Now this sounds kind of kitschy today, but it's important to remember that George was coming into his own during a very, very different time in the United States. The late 1930s were the tail end of the Great Depression, and World War II was right around the corner. This was an era where, well, men just didn't do such things. And furthermore, going to see a wrestling show had previously been about seeing the physical performance of the matter. It wasn't about titillating the crowd just for the sake of it. I'm sure that there were plenty of old-timers who watched the various weddings of George and Betty, who harumphed like those two old coots from the Muppets, Statler and Waldorf, thinking that they were sullying the good name of both society and wrestling all at the same time. Well, they'd better get ready to harumph some more, because the best was yet to come. See, prior to this point, George was still kind of a run-of-the-mill tough guy, even if he had brought on his wife as a sort of on-stage backup character. But that's the type of thing that has a limited shelf life. You can't reenact the same wedding across the country for multiple years, after all. That might just cause people to think the whole thing's fake. But the two of them were about to hit a winning strategy. And it all started with a robe. See, marrying Betty didn't just provide George Wagner with a sense of stability and happiness. It also provided him another partner with which to engage in a more creative side. Betty was just as skilled a seamstress as George's beloved late mother was, and just as interested in exploring color and style. And soon, the pug-nosed wrestler was coming out to the ring in increasingly gaudier robes, and the fans started to take notice too. It all came to a head during a match in Eugene, Oregon. As Don Owen, a major wrestling promoter in Oregon at the time, told it, quote, Betty had made George a robe, and when he went into the ring that night, he took special care in folding it, end quote. That's a polite way of saying that George was wasting everyone's time that night as he excessively folded and refolded the robe until it was just right. And while he was trying to line up the seams to make sure they were perfect, the fans started to get impatient. And when fans start to get impatient, they start to get irritated. And when fans are irritated, well, I'll just let Don Owen continue telling the story. Quote, the fans got on him pretty good, and Betty was there and got into it with the fans. She slapped one of them, and George went out of the ring and belted the fan. Anyway, the booing was tremendous, and the next week there was a real big crowd, and everyone booed George, end quote. And what was George Wagner's response to the fans' rage over his robe? Simple. He started milking it. And the fans would start to take note nationwide of this prissy prick and his stupid robe. Now, there's something important that you need to understand about the wrestling business. I've talked about it before, but I also want to do a deep dive here to help you. It's more of an art, not a science, kind of like cooking as opposed to baking. Now, I'm certainly no expert myself, but at the core, each and every performer out there is seeking to get something called heat. I found a pretty good article on ESPN.com that gives a decent definition of the concept. Quote, the primary goal of professional wrestling is to make fans have a visceral, emotional reaction to what it is that the promotion is putting on its show, end quote. That reaction is heat. I've been to plenty of wrestling shows myself, and I can say this. You do go in knowing that what you're seeing is orchestrated and that the show was decided before any of the performers got out on the stage. But if for a brief moment you decide not to care about that because you want to see this guy you hate get clobbered or the guy you like finally win the big one, then congratulations. You, my friend, have felt the heat. Now, not all performers are good at drawing heat. They can just fall flat, or they can go too far in a certain direction that the audience doesn't actually like, or they might just make you feel apathetic and bored. But there is a rare breed of wrestler that doesn't just draw heat in the moment. Their very existence is enough to get people not only pissed off, but pissed off enough to consistently and frequently buy tickets to let them know how pissed off they are. George Wagner was going to be the first one to really crack that code. With the help of his dutiful wife Betty, George began to evolve. As Sports Illustrated reported in a career retrospective on the man, quote, at first the brown hair became auburn. Then he read about an old friend, Dizzy Davis, throwing gardenias into the crowd in Mexico and getting a new nickname, Gardenia Davis. So George decided to become a glamour boy, too. He let his hair grow longer and wavier. The next step was to a beauty salon in Hollywood to inquire about a wig. After some thought, it was decided a wig would be too easy to yank off in the ring, so the beautician turned George over to two Hungarian hairstylists, Frank and Joseph, who recommended that he grow his hair long and bleach it blonde, if he had the guts. "If guts is all it takes, I've got plenty," said George. End quote. His hair now dyed a platinum blonde, and his entire demeanor changed from the formerly nondescript George Wagner. All that was missing was a name. Who was he now? Well, during one night at the Eugene, Oregon National Guard Armory, as George Wagner strolled out to the ring, Betty was watching her husband from the front row. So taken with the way her man had transformed, Betty turned to her mother and said of the man in the ring who was currently twirling in a blue satin robe, quote, "He's gorgeous," end quote. And just like that, in a flash of lightning, that was it. George Wagner was no more. Gorgeous George had taken his place. Now, Gorgeous George came around at a time when the American public, perhaps as a result of being awash with anti-Nazi and anti-Japanese, sadly, propaganda from the war, started to shift. Prior to this point, Americans cheered for the good guys. But now there was a change in the wind. Now it was clear that while Americans might cheer for the good guys, they might cheer against the bad guys even harder. And Gorgeous George would be head and shoulders above the rest of his competition in that. The manner in which he entered the ring bears highlighting, if only to show just how ridiculous of a man he was. Quote, "Before each match, his valet, a personification of dignity in striped pants, vest, and tails, would walk stiffly down the aisle and enter the ring carrying a silver-plated tray. On the tray was a mirror, a little carpet, and a fancified flit gun full of perfume-scented disinfectant. 'It's Chanel No. 10, said Gorgeous. "Why be half safe?" The valet, always somber, would set the tray down in one corner and carefully spray the mat. Then the lights would dim. A magnificent rendition of Pomp and Circumstance would thunder out of the loudspeaker, and a spotlight would pinpoint the star as he strode majestically down an aisle. End quote. If this sounds a little bit outside the norm, then rest assured that's exactly what George was going for. In an era where societal expectations had men working and providing, of ascribing to the Protestant work ethic of being taciturn and a provider without drawing too much attention to yourself or your feelings, and God forbid your friends see you cry, here came this prissy prick in a robe, prancing about the ring, acting like he was the Queen of Sheba. For lack of a better way to put it, Gorgeous George was playing on his audience's latent homophobia. He was a man acting like, well, like a girl. And his antics didn't stop once the match finally started. Now, early in his career, George Wagner had wrestled like many of the folks of the time, as a dignified, tough, hard-nosed, no-nonsense athlete. Gorgeous George, however, wrestled like a twerp. If there was a chance for him to cheat, he took it. Things like eye gouges and kidney punches were part and parcel of his new repertoire. And whenever he looked to be in danger, he ran or hid behind the referee. He'd bellow at the crowd, calling them all ignorant peasants and beneath contempt. He was a punk, a wimp, a coward, and frankly a jackass. But he was also the toast of the coast, the sensation of the nation, and the human orchid. And the audience ate it up. He was so popular that songs were made about him. Like take this little romp from the 1940s. Quote, "He has an armful of muscle and a head full of curls. He wrestles with the fellows and thrills all the girls. A 2-ton truck with a velvet sheen. Gorgeous George is the man I mean. He has a chest like a mountain and a face like a dream. He starts women swooning and makes men scream." End quote. Kind of sounded a bit more like slam poetry there than music, but I don't know how the beat of that song went. Now, George, for his part, was more than happy to play into it all. Quote, "I do not think I am gorgeous," he once said, "but what is my opinion against millions of others?" End quote. George, who now wore his hair in long yellow curls, kept it all in place above his head in gold-plated bobby pins, which, of course, he called Georgie pins, and that he passed out to his fans. But because nothing is free in this life, George would make anyone who took one of his pins repeat the following oath, quote, "I solemnly swear and promise I will never confuse this gold Georgie pin with a common ordinary bobby pin, so help me gorgeous George," end quote. There were some reports that Betsy Truman, the wife of the president, had a Georgie pin of her own. Now, to be fair, there's a saying out there, it's often attributed to Pablo Picasso, that good artists create and great artists steal. And Gorgeous George was no different. Turns out that just as George and Betty were putting together the finishing touches on the Gorgeous one, there was another wrestler out there that they almost certainly would have known about. And that wrestler was Lord Patrick Lansdowne. Now, Lansdowne wasn't his name. He was born Wilbur Finran, and if that doesn't already sound like the most Irish name you've ever heard, consider his first in-ring names, Wilbur or Patrick Finnegan. But Finnegan wasn't really getting any attention. So as wrestling historian Patrick W. Reed noted, he made a change. Quote, "It was in 1933 that he began to try his luck as a villain, first as Duke or Lord Finnegan, before expanding the name to Lord Patrick Lansdowne Finnegan, and by mid-1934 dropping Finnegan altogether, and with it the last suggestion of Irish heritage. Having failed to catch on as a hero, Lansdowne realized that there was an easy way to make the heavily Irish audiences that he had once hoped would cheer him on bay for his blood. The former farm boy reinvented himself as an English aristocrat. It was a gimmick that attracted nuclear heat from the Irish and Irish Americans, and soon from Americans across the country. Lansdowne styled his hair ridiculously, he wore a cape and a monocle, affected an outrageous accent, and was accompanied to the ring by valets and butlers." End quote. Gee, sound familiar? Now, Lansdowne would never make the heights that George did, mostly because his intended audience appeal was more niche, and because the concept of national entertainment the way we think of today wasn't really a concept at the time. He was a little too early. But Gorgeous George was going to hit it big right as the nation was pulling itself out of the Great Depression, and frankly, needed a big spectacle to behold and boo. And George was the one who gave it to them. But there was also another reason why George would hit it so big. Television. It might be wild to think of today, but in the early 1940s, television was an unproven and untrusted medium of entertainment. And it was also wildly unavailable to the public. The 1939 New York World's Fair was the first big demonstration to the public for what television could be, but then World War II had to go and ruin everything. It all got delayed. I found an article on paleofuture.com written by Matt Novak that discusses the early stages of television, and it reads absolutely insane when one considers that we're living in the era of 1080p high-definition images. From Novak's article, quote, "Back in 1944, the U.S. was still fighting in World War II, and Americans couldn't buy a TV in any store, thanks to government restrictions that focused all high-tech manufacturing on the war effort. But that didn't stop people from speculating what TV would look like after the war. And nobody knew for certain what people would want to watch on the emerging medium, let alone when they might watch. In fact, there was some doubt TV programs would even be broadcast during the day." End quote. As it turns out, people did watch TV during the day, and wrestling is what they wanted to see. HistoryOfWrestling.com makes the bold claim that, quote, "Professional wrestling was TV's first legitimate hit with the public, the first program that ever drew any real numbers for the new technology, and Gorgeous George was directly responsible for all of the commotion." End quote. Some entertainment historians have suggested that Gorgeous George was more of a reason for folks to buy a television set when they were made readily available to the public than anyone or anything else. Now, part of that might have been that professional wrestling, as it was pretty cheap to pay for, and television stations and a means and effort to get set up weren't too picky about what they were going to put on their screens. But still, it was compelling television. On November 11th, 1947, Gorgeous George made his first national televised appearance. Years later, In their 2022 list of the top 100 televised acts of the 20th century, Entertainment Weekly ranked that first debut number 45 on their list. You'll note that I haven't done a lot of talking about the titles that George won. Well, that's because, barring a few titles here and there that were more regional promotions pretending to be big-time outfits, George didn't really win a lot of titles. And that wasn't the point. People didn't really pay to see George win the belt. They paid to hear Pomp and Circumstance play over the loudspeakers, to take in the spectacle of this sensation, and then hopefully see him get his ass kicked. And he got paid. In the 1950s, at the peak of his star power, George was earning more than $100,000 a year. The numbers vary on exactly how much, with some saying as high as $160,000 a year, making him one of the highest paid athletes on the planet. Now, in case you need an inflation calculator, $100,000 a year in the 1950s is more than $1.3 million a year. George was a millionaire. And he was an inspiration to many an entertainment figure. A 1951 Bugs Bunny cartoon featured a one-off character called Ravishing Ronald, which is just about as close as one can get to parody without straight-up infringement. He also was an inspiration point for some bigger cultural points. In his 2005 autobiography, I Feel Good, James Brown, yeah, that James Brown, the godfather of soul James Brown, claimed that he used parts of George's style to, quote, create the James Brown you see on stage, end quote. And in his memoir, Chronicles Volume 1, Bob Dylan claimed that he was inspired to keep at it as a struggling young musician when, as he performed one night, George entered the venue where he was playing and took notice of the young performer. As Dylan remembered it, quote, he winked and seemed to mouth the phrase, "You're making it come alive." I never forgot it. It was all the recognition and encouragement I would need for years, end quote. But by far, George's greatest impact and protege could be found in the world of sports. In 1961, a young boxer named Cassius Clay had just won his 6th fight in 6 months and was on a Las Vegas radio show where he encountered George in action. As Clay remembered it, quote, George started shouting, "If this bum beats me, I'll crawl across the ring and cut off my hair, but it's not going to happen because I'm the greatest fighter in the world." And all the time I was saying to myself, man, I want to see this fight. And the whole place was sold out when Gorgeous George wrestled, including me. And that's when I decided if I talked more, there was no telling how much people would pay to see me, end quote. Clay also got to talking one-on-one with George, and George gave him the following advice, quote, "A lot of people will pay to see someone shut your mouth, so keep on bragging, keep on sassing, and always be outrageous," end quote. And throughout his career, Cassius Clay, who the world would also know as Muhammad Ali, never, ever stopped talking. And when you boil it down to that, therein probably lies the evolutionary link at its strongest point. The sheer number of athletes who came up in the mid to late 20th century who either respected, idolized, or wanted to emulate Muhammad Ali is innumerable. And the sheer staying power of Ali comes not just from his great boxing, and make no mistake, he was great, but in the power of his personality. Ali, in and of himself, was a spectacle, and he made a lot of money doing it. And if making himself a spectacle was at the alleged inspiration of one human orchid, then is it really much of a stretch to say that Gorgeous George is the reason why athletes aren't afraid to make themselves larger than life? I mean, I sure think it's not that big of a stretch. So why don't more people know about George and give credit where it's due? Well, herein lies the dark side of the ring. There's a somewhat morbid element to being a professional wrestling fan, and it's the acceptance that because the majority of the performers burn the candle at both ends, they live big and hard, and they die fast and young. And it gets even worse if a wrestler begins to live the gimmick. That's an industry term for basically literally living like the character that you play in the ring. So if you live the gimmick of a rich so-and-so, that's going to catch up with you, and it's hard to turn off. One of George's friends remarked on this problem, quote, "I saw him the last time about 1960. You'd be alone in a hotel room with him and he'd be acting just like he was in the ring. I had to tell him off a couple of times and remind him to knock off that stuff with an old friend," End quote. But George couldn't stop. And another thing he couldn't stop was drinking. His high-flying way of life would eventually cost him his first love. Betty Hansen, though she loved George dearly, ultimately tired of the way that his vices were turning him into something that she no longer recognized nor wanted to be a part of. In 1951, George and Betty divorced. George would remarry a woman named Sherry, who became an on-screen valet for his performances, but George clearly didn't learn the lessons that his divorce might have tried to teach him, and by 1962, he and Sherry were divorced, with her taking custody of their kid. Now, Sherry was wistful, years later remarking, quote, "Sober, there wasn't a sweeter, kinder, more considerate man in the world. He didn't really have the nerve to do all those things. That's why he drank. When he was sober, he was shy. I don't ever regret meeting him and marrying him. When he wasn't drinking, it was a good life." End quote. The same year that he and Sherry divorced, George developed serious liver problems, and the doctor told him his wrestling career was over. Naturally, George didn't listen, and he didn't stop drinking or wrestling, and he was soon hospitalized. When he got out of the hospital, he just went right back into the same habit. It's like he couldn't help himself. You know, I told you he was making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year? Yeah, he blew most all of that on either drinking or bad investments. He sold off his assets to pay off his debts, he kept drinking, and by Christmas of 1963 he was so broke that he couldn't even buy his son a skateboard for the holidays. He had to make one himself. But he wouldn't even get to see his son use it. On Christmas Eve 1963, George Wagner had a massive heart attack. He would linger for 2 days, and then on December 26, 1963, the gorgeous one was no more. He was only 48 years old. You know, in researching the story of Gorgeous George, I couldn't help but feel a great sense of sadness. Not only for the sudden and tragic end to his life, no one should be checking out that early, but also for the way that, well, he seemed to lose himself over the course of time. In reading John Capuya's excellent book, which I've cited from multiple times and highly recommend, you could feel the love and partnership that developed between George and his first wife, Betty, which is understandable when one realizes that Betty herself was a major source for that book before she passed away in 2011. To see that solid and dependable partnership slowly defray over time as George Wagner kind of disappeared into the sparkling sensation of Gorgeous George is heartbreaking. And the saddest part is, as wrestling writer David Shoemaker, aka The Masked Man, put it, when George died, America changed the channel. They just kind of moved on to the next thing. It feels like a cautionary tale of knowing not to let the trappings and temptations of fame drain you and leave you a battered husk on the side of the highway to superstardom, lest the newer models of who you were drive past you and take your place. But while the public might have forgotten about George himself, they have never forgotten about his impact. Anytime you see a touchdown dance in the NFL, you're seeing the traces of Gorgeous George. Anytime that a fighter, UFC or boxing, goes on a wildly entertaining rant that convinces you to pay money to see him or her eat shit, you're seeing the traces of Gorgeous George. And of course, anytime you're at a wrestling show and you watch a man or woman act in the most asinine, irritating, and ultimately hateable way, you're seeing the traces of Gorgeous George. And most importantly, you're paying to see their comeuppance. Yeah, they might not get it today. They might not get it tomorrow. But they're going to get it. And on the journey to seeing them get it, they've got you. And they're going to take you on an emotional journey, one that you are more than willing to go on, and more importantly, part with your hard-earned dollars for the chance to see with your own two eyes. I'd imagine that the Gorgeous One is smiling wherever he is about how the sporting world is basically ripping him off en masse, but he'd probably just call me a dirty peasant for daring to use his name without permission, to which I would boo him and tell him I hope someone kicks his ass, and that I would pay to see it happen. And that, at the end of the day, is what it's all about. You've been listening to Surreal Sports Stories. Sources for today's episodes include CNN.com, Sports Illustrated, HistoryOfWrestling.com, Sportster.com, John Capuya's excellent small songs work for you listen to your podcast. Do us a favor and smash that subscribe button